don't lie.
The Wilmot Proviso was the first sectionalizing legislation that catalyzed the polarization between the North and the South. Upon the acquisition of the Mexican territory, David Wilmot, an anti-slavery Democrat, proposed the Wilmot Proviso, prohibiting slavery in any territory from Mexico. This legislation failed in the Senate as Democrats and Whigs tried to avoid the sectionalizing issue of slavery. With this apathetic leadership, anti-slavery advocates on the political fringes created the Free Soil Party and nominated Martin Van Buren for president. The poor leadership by Northern and Southern leaders prevented any conclusive plan from passing and only emphasized their ideological differences.
K. Polk was a man of contradictory leadership. First, he supported the Wilmot Proviso, which prohibited slavery in any territory acquired from the Mexican War. People in the South, in the meantime, carried the decree that all Americans had equal rights in these new territories. Therefore, they felt entitled to bring their property slaves to the frontier. Despite the position Polk took with Wilmot Proviso, banning slavery in the newly acquired land, he soon contradicted himself by supporting popular sovereignty. Prior to the end of his term, by the support of this policy, Polk found that it was the responsibility of the newly acquired territories to establish the status of slavery in their regions. Being that these newly acquired regions were in the South, it was most probable that slavery would expand, making the majority of America a slaveholding nation. Now, President Polk garnered the support of the South, while the North grew more and more hostile to his leadership. The divide that was generated by Polk's support of each of these policies polarized the nation. When he supported one policy, the South approved and the North resented. Meanwhile, when he supported another, the opposite occurred. With leadership such as this, how is the Union to stay preserved?
1850, Clay presented to Congress what he believed to be a permanent solution to the sectional problems that were arising in the United States. Although his plan was fair towards both the North and the South, Clay did not garner enough support for this bill to pass. Granted, this legislation would have no slave restrictions for the Californian and Mexican territories. Slave policies would be left to either the territorial governments or the occupants of these areas. Clay's failure to create a real slave policy in the territories only allowed the Northerners to be concerned of slave expansion and Southerners to hope that slavery spread. Most strikingly, Clay's lack of leadership is best displayed by his proposed slave policy in the District of Columbia. In the bill, Clay endorses that slavery is legal in the nation's capital, siding with the South. But he then says that trading slaves is illegal in the capital, siding with the North. This policy for the nation's capital could not be more telling of Clay's failure to lead. The fact that the nation's capital had a divided plan for slavery only foreshadows the divide that would arise within the nation.
Stephen A. Douglas was a Democratic senator from Illinois. His faulty leadership is best seen in his role in the Compromise of 1850. In this compromise, Douglas was primarily concerned with spreading technology in the West, the region which he governed. Specifically, Douglas was working for his own gain, eager to develop railroads in his home state of Illinois. Douglas, along with other young leaders of the Senate, managed to take the insufficient compromise proposed by Clay and divide it into separate measures they felt would pass. In doing so, many senators such as Douglas added amendments for their own personal gain. Through this division of the bill, Southern states and Northern states were able to only approve causes they supported, preventing the North and South from coming to an agreement. Douglas's division of this bill only furthered the sectional divide between the North and South. Granted, no compromise ever arose. Millard Fillmore, the president at the time, supported this bill that Douglas had divided. In Fillmore's opinion, this bill was a triumph of statesmanship, meaning he was ignorant to the fact that it was only preventing compromise.
Douglas sparked sectional rivalry between the North and South through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas proposed the creation of Free State Nebraska in America's newly acquired Mexican territory, although he expected great opposition from the South. In an effort to appease the Southerners, Douglas inserted a provision for popular sovereignty, allowing the state to determine the status of slavery. Although this was an attempt to compromise with the South, Southerners feared that the citizens of Nebraska, many of which from the North, would vote for the territory to be a free state. upsetting the equilibrium between free and slave states. Douglas furthered this sectional tension that was arising by upsetting Northerners through his repeal of the Missouri Compromise, which the North believed to be a distinct policy keeping the Union intact, which they believed preserved the balance of free and slave states. Adding even more insult to injury, Douglas divided the region in question into Nebraska and Kansas. Granted, the location of the territories would result in Nebraska being a free state and Kansas a slave state.
Douglas's lack of leadership caused him to think that the policy would be supported by all, when in fact it spurred opposition from both the Democratic and the Whig Party. The Whig Party and the Democratic Party were so divided by this issue that people on the political fringes joined together and created the Republican Party, further sectionalizing American politics.
Franklin Pierce was a polarizing president because he endorsed the expansion of slavery through his support of the Kansas, Nebraska, and Bleeding Kansas. When the issue of Bleeding Kansas came about, Pierce denounced the free states who created their own constitution without slavery. Through this denouncement, Pierce threw his support behind pro-slavery forces, only empowering them, which resulted in more violence and polarization.
John Brown first became well known as an extreme abolitionist when he led the murder of the 5 pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. This would later be known as a Potawatomi Massacre. This barbarian massacre, led by John Brown, led to even more civil strife, inspiring irregular guerrilla warfare. These massacres further polarized the North and South. Granted, Northerners and Southerners alike believed that the instability in Kansas was a product of the other side's aggression. Because of John Brown's instigation of this conflict, the idea of compromise between the North and South became more unlikely.
The significance of Roger Taney's leadership in the Dred Scott case is twofold. First, by establishing that Scott could not legally sue his master's widow, Taney further entrenched the idea that slaves did not have constitutional rights. Taney also found that Congress had no authority in passing a law depriving people of their property. This statement insinuates that the federal government has no authority to act on the issues of westward expansion and slavery. Through this jurisdiction, if the government has no authority on the greatly polarizing issues of slavery or expansion, how is the government to save the dividing Union?
James Buchanan was a president of indecision. Nevertheless, he generated enough confidence in himself to endorse the divisive Dred Scott case. In doing so, Buchanan was supporting Taney's ideology for a slave nation, although this Supreme Court decision generated much dismay in the North. The Northern mindset was that slavery was tolerable, granted it stay in the South. But since Taney's jurisdiction took away Congress's power to regulate slavery in the new territories, the North feared that slavery would easily spread into much of the West. This possibility was too daunting to ignore. For many Northerners uninterested in the slave issue, they grew concerned with the widespread of slavery. Cognizant of this fact, Buchanan still endorsed Taney's opinion, although it could lead to an internal divide. Lincoln's election was the final catalyst that caused the South to secede from the Union. Therefore, many Southerners viewed the election of Lincoln, a Republican, detrimentally. Following a long line of sectional presidents, the North and South were in dire need for a unifying voice. Nevertheless, Southerners perceived Lincoln to be attacking them, granted he was from a party with strong opposition to slavery. In Lincoln's opinion, slavery was morally wrong and could lead to the enslavement of other minorities. However, he was not an abolitionist, striving to rid the nation of slavery. In fact, he was indifferent to this institution. Through Lincoln's indifferent opinion, the North was upset that he failed to promote the abolition of slavery. Meanwhile, many in the South were upset that he was not defending their ideology. With that, Lincoln's indifference provided the final straw in the sectionalization between the North and South, eventually leading to the secession and the Civil War.